Across 8 seasons, Arrow has generated a huge fanbase and impressed many a naysayer who thought that nobody would care about a Green Arrow TV series. After all, this wasn't Batman, this wasn't Superman, this wasn't Wonder Woman, this wasn't The Flash, this wasn't... well, you get the idea. However, despite all of the fans that Green Arrow now has as a result of Arrow, that initial buzz around the show was largely flat, as the majority of the series' potential audience had no real interest in the Emerald Archer. But boy, how that has changed as the show progressed, particularly from season 2 onwards. Like all such series, of course, Arrow hasn't been a complete home run. For the most part, it's certainly been a brilliant genre show, yet there have still been a few issues and niggles along the way. But that doesn't mean there's not plenty to celebrate as well. Let's take a look at the ups and downs across the show's run. I'm Will for What Culture, and here are 6 times Arrow improved Green Arrow mythology, and 4 times it failed. Let's start with the positives. 6. Felicity Smoak. Many casual comic book fans may think that Felicity Smoak was purely a creation of Arrow. While the Arrow incarnation of Felicity is indeed rather different to her comic book counterpart, Felicity Smoak actually first appeared in the pages of DC Comics back in 1984. She may have been a supporting character who only appeared briefly, but Felicity's 1984 funny book debut in The Fury of Firestorm 23 saw her positioned as the boss of a New York computer software company. Not only that, but she found herself butting heads with Firestorm before marrying his father, Ed Raymond. What Arrow did so well is that it took this comic book character and improved her 100 times over. Sure, this Felicity retained her computer smarts, yet Ms. Smoak was made into a pivotal part of the overall 8-season arc of Arrow, to the point that she managed to be one of the few people to calm the wild beast that is Oliver Queen. 5. It helped to showcase lesser villains. For the majority of viewers, Arrow, like so many of its fellow Arrowverse shows, has used its platform to showcase certain lesser-known villains. There were plenty of one-and-done appearances from various DC rogues, but Arrow also managed to give so many bad guys and gals multi-episode arcs that dug deeper on what made them tick, or even integrated them directly into the story of Oliver Queen. Characters such as Malcolm Merlyn, Damien Dark, Brother Blood, Deadshot, China White, Ravager, Count Vertigo, Bronze Tiger, Cupid, and Brick are just a smattering of comic book villains who were brought back for several episodes of Arrow in order to give you a sense of their own personal arcs. In fact, some of these, such as Ravager and Brother Blood, were main players for an entire season, while Malcolm Merlyn has obviously been used as a mainstay of Arrow throughout the majority of its 8-season run. 4. The show doesn't shy away from Oliver's killing streak. More often than not, the golden rule of comics is that superheroes do not kill. Well, not unless there is absolutely no other alternative. And even then, the majority of heroes will refuse to go through with the taking of a life, no matter how evil the person in question may be. Even in the Green Arrow books, whichever origin story has been served up over the decades, none of them have ever shown the Emerald Archer as a merciless killer. But in Arrow, the show's first season completely and utterly embraces that, and isn't embarrassed to do so. In the context of Arrow, it would make sense for Oliver's 5-year stint in the wilderness to result in him returning to the city on a ruthless mission of revenge. Not only did Ollie have several stays on Lian Yu during that period, he was also trained to be a cold-blooded killer by some truly despicable sorts. Despite running the risk of making their central hero look far less than heroic, Arrow embraced the vengeance and brutality that Oliver Queen would realistically have on his mind in those early days. And then, well, the show built on that and used it to project Oliver's growth as a character as the series progressed through its next several seasons. 3. The brutal effect of the Lazarus Pit. In the world of DC Comics, the Lazarus Pit is synonymous with Ra's al Ghul. The demon has regularly taken dips in these pits in order to keep himself alive and well, hence why Ra's doesn't appear to ever age, and any wounds he suffers aren't quite as fatal as they should be. But while the comic book Lazarus Pits are merely dropped into a story now and again with no real hoopla, and merely just to perk up somebody who may find themselves on death's door, it's rare that the Lazarus Pit has been shown to have any major after effects. Bar Jason Todd going insane, the Lazarus Pits of comics seem relatively safe to use. In Arrow, however, this is far different. Ever since the Lazarus Pit was introduced in Arrow, it has been made abundantly clear that any dip in these pools will have some severe side effects, to the point that we've seen people outright refuse to use a Lazarus Pit regardless of their wounds. 2. Slade Wilson's descent into madness. Names really don't get much more badass than Deathstroke the Terminator, but while Slade Wilson has long been a fan favorite comic book villain of many, he's never been as wonderfully fleshed out as he has been during Arrow's 8 seasons. Season 2 of Arrow remains one of the very best single seasons of genre TV from the past decade. A bold statement, sure, yet seeing the descent into madness of Slade Wilson was glorious to watch unravel. If you remember, Slade and Oliver ended the show's first season flashback moments as brothers, and that was a relationship that continued to develop in the flashbacks of the show's second season. In that second year, the flashbacks ran concurrently with present-day attacks on Starling City that were ultimately revealed to have been masterminded by the presumed dead Slade Wilson and his army of soldiers. Since that second year, Wilson has turned up at several occasions, as an enemy, as a friend, as an uneasy ally. Even though the comics have positioned Slade Wilson as an anti-hero at times over the decades, never has Slade been given more room to breathe and show as many sides as he has in Arrow. 1. It got more fans invested in the comics. One of the very best things accomplished by Arrow during the show's 8 seasons is that the success of the storytelling and characterization of the series has led to fans taking a deep dive into the comic book world of Green Arrow. What greater effect can a TV show have on an established comic book mythology than getting people to check out said comics? That may possibly be the greatest compliment to place on Arrow, that the show made new fans of Oliver Queen, both in terms of the live-action Oliver and in terms of his comic book counterparts. Previously, many non-Green Arrow fans may have simply labeled the Emerald Archer as a Robin Hood knockoff, or possibly even Batman Light. Instead, Arrow proved that, while Green Arrow does indeed share certain characteristics with both of those other heroes, the Master Bowman is a fantastic character in his own right. However, it's not all good news. Let's take a look at the times Arrow failed Green Arrow mythology. 4. Butchered Black Canary. No one character is as important in the comics to Green Arrow as Black Canary. Not only do these two often fight side by side, not only do they become romantically involved, but Oliver Queen and Dinah Laurel Lance actually become man and wife. Upon Katie Cassidy being confirmed to be playing Laurel Lance in Arrow, the seeds were already sown amongst longtime DC fans that would be getting Black Canary. And we did. Well, kind of. The first Black Canary we got was brilliant and badass. That was until she was killed and then resurrected again courtesy of a Lazarus Pit. Laurel Lance did indeed take up the moniker of Black Canary, of course, yet the problem was this Laurel just felt a little off. That was the way the character was written. She was a complete and utter hindrance to Team Arrow as she began to suit up, and not just in a learning the ropes kind of way, for Laurel became a drag on the entire show, to the point that when the character was killed off, nobody really cared. Thankfully, the Dinah Drake version of Black Canary did prove to be a great addition to Arrow, and the show has even made amends in how it's handled the Earth 2 version of Laurel Lance. 3. Death is irrelevant. Now, for the most part, death in comics is completely and utterly irrelevant. That is, apart from a handful of exceptions, such as the Green Arrow. Ever since Superman was simply revealed to have been having a kip in 1993's legendary The Death of Superman, death in comic books has usually been a simple plot point used to advance a story, with it no longer the permanent arrangement it once was. Back in 1995, Green Arrow sacrificed his own life in order to protect Metropolis. This was a hard-hitting death that was felt across DC Comics for years to come, particularly for poor Connor Hawke as he tried to continue on with the Green Arrow moniker his father had made so famous. Oliver Queen wouldn't be fully back into the fold of main DC Comics until 2001, when Kevin Smith's Quiver arc brought Ollie back. But even then, it wasn't simply a case of Oliver being back as Green Arrow with no questions asked. Instead, the resurrected Queen would struggle to find his place in the world, and he'd take several years to actually become the Green Arrow once again. In Arrow, sadly, death has been a complete non-factor. When Oliver was brutally stabbed through, kicked off a cliff top and left for dead by Ra's al Ghul during Arrow's 3rd season, the seemingly dead Oliver Queen was back on the road to recovery by the very next episode. And this has been a trend with numerous characters across the show's run. 2. Too reliant on Lian Yu. Okay, so Oliver Queen was presumed dead after the Queen's Gambit was lost at sea, rendering all aboard supposedly deceased. Instead, Oliver was washed up on the shores of Lian Yu, where he would begin to hone plenty of the skills he'd later utilize as the Green Arrow. That was great, that was fine, and the first 2 seasons of Arrow culminated, in a flashback sense, in Ollie finally making it off Lian Yu. Despite following seasons seeing the flashback elements of the show taking Arrow to Hong Kong and Russia, he always seemed to end up lumbered back on Lian Lian Yu, and similarly, the modern day narrative of Arrow kept bringing Oliver back to this strange and brutal island. Those scenes on Lian Yu have been handled very well, yet Arrow has spent 8 seasons becoming a little too reliant on Lian Yu. As with anything else, too much of a good thing is a bad thing. 1. It reiterated that Green Arrow is Batman Light. With Oliver Queen, the CW and Warner Bros. TV gave audiences one of the greatest characters in the history of DC TV projects. After a slightly ropey start in the first season, Oliver truly became great. However, the 8 seasons of Arrow have managed to hammer home the point that Green Arrow is Batman Light. Let's take a checklist. There's no superpowers, check. Millions of dollars at his disposal, check. Dead parents, check. A rotating roster of sidekicks at his disposal, check. Playboy lifestyle, check. Of course, elements of those points have altered over the years, yet the basic characteristics of the Master Bowman for so much of Arrow's run has seen him being depicted as a Batman wannabe. To make things worse on this front, Arrow has utilized a whole host of villains usually associated with the Caped Crusader during its 8 seasons. From Ra's al Ghul to Deadshot to Firefly to Anarchy to Dollmaker to Clock King and so many more, Arrow's use of bat foes again hit home to audiences that one of the main reasons we even got Arrow as a show is because Warner Bros. Wouldn't agree to a straight-up Batman series being made.